From forgotten scrolls to future hope, this is Messages of Old. Chapter 1. From River to Royal Court. Picture the Nile at dawn as a ribbon of copper light winding toward an empty horizon. Reeds sway and ibis skim the surface, unaware that this calm morning will ripple across human history. Somewhere along a backwater inlet, a young Hebrew woman named Jochebed kneels in the mud. She is working against a countdown that no sundial can show. Pharaoh has decreed that every Hebrew boy must be drowned. Her infant son Moses sleeps in a papyrus basket caulked with pitch, his lungs rising and falling in that trusting rhythm only newborns possess. When she slides the basket among the reeds, she is not abandoning him. She is drafting him into a future she cannot yet imagine. Downriver, the daughter of Pharaoh steps into the sparkling water with her attendants. Egyptian frescoes show royal bathing as a ritual of purity and power. Archaeologists even identify specific bathing pavilions along Nile tributaries near Memphis. The princess spots the basket and sends a maid to retrieve it. When she draws back the cloth and sees the baby, the text says she feels compassion, a word that in ancient Semitic languages refers to the stirring of one's innermost parts. She decides to raise the child in the palace. Egyptian adoption contracts from the New Kingdom period reveal a legal framework that makes her decision plausible. The adopted child becomes heir with full privileges, though here none of the scribes realize they are welcoming a future liberator. Moses grows up reading hieroglyphs and solving geometry problems used for resetting boundary stones after each Nile flood. He learns chariot driving on the royal training field. Yet he also hears whispered lullabies in Hebrew from his biological mother, who has been hired as a wet nurse. That double identity frames the tension of the entire Exodus. Empire education clashing with memory of slavery. Sociologists call this code switching. Moses lives it daily. At 40 years old, he walks among the forced labor crews near Pi-Ramses, the store city identified with massive mud brick walls visible to tourists today. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew. Adrenaline overrides diplomacy. He kills the Egyptian and buries the body in sand. The desert does not keep secrets well. Soon Pharaoh seeks his death, and Moses flees east across the Sinai Peninsula. Nomadic trade routes of the era show that the journey from the Delta to Midian could be done in less than 2 weeks if one travels hard by camel. Moses takes considerably longer, pausing often, absorbing the vast silence. In Midian he meets Jethro, marries Zipporah, and settles into a shepherd's life. Every step shapes him for a future that will demand both wilderness skills and patience with stubborn followers. One afternoon, while tending sheep near Horeb, he sees a shrub blazing with fire, yet not consumed. Ancient rabbinic commentaries suggest that the miracle is not merely the physics of flame, but the revelation that holiness can inhabit the ordinary. When Moses approaches, a voice names him twice and tells him to remove his sandals. Peasant or prince, you come barefoot on sacred ground. The divine commission follows. He must return to Egypt and demand release for his people. Moses offers multiple excuses. Who am I? What is your name? What if they will not believe me? The voice answers each with a sign or promise. For the audience in the United States, this dialogue resonates with every mission statement or career pivot. The impulses of self-doubt are ancient and universal. Back in Egypt, the narrative widens. Moses and Aaron stand before the new Pharaoh, possibly identified with Ramesses the Great's son Merneptah, whose stele records a people called Israel already in Canaan years later. Moses speaks the famous line, "Let my people go." Pharaoh's response weaponizes labor. Bricks must still meet quota, though straw will no longer be provided. Modern economic historians note the psychology of oppressive systems, increase hardship to dampen dissent. Instead, resentment ferments. The stage is set for the plagues, a sequence that introduces a science detective puzzle still discussed in journals today. Plague 1 turns the Nile to blood, or so it appears. Hydrologists proposed that an algal bloom of toxic dinoflagellates could color the river red and suffocate fish. When the ecosystem collapses, frogs flee the waterway, becoming plague 2. Dead frogs rot, inviting gnats or mosquitoes, plague 3. As insect populations explode, they bite livestock and humans, spreading anthrax-like diseases that could explain plague 5 on cattle and plague 6 of boils. Meanwhile, shifting weather patterns, perhaps tied to an El Niño cycle, might breed the supersized hail of plague 7, which damages barley crops but leaves wheat unaffected, just as the biblical text notes. Locust swarms, plague 8, often follow storms because wet sand triggers egg hatching. Darkness, plague 9, could be the Khamsin dust storms that obscure daylight across Egypt. These scientific theories do not cancel the theological claims of the narrative. Instead, they illustrate what happens when natural chains of cause and effect intersect with moral purpose. Inside Pharaoh's palace, the stakes are psychological as much as climatic. Each plague challenges a specific Egyptian deity. The Nile god Hapi, the frog goddess Heket, the sun god Ra, all lose face. Pharaoh himself, regarded as divine, watches his authority erode like flood silt. Yet he keeps offering half concessions, then rescinding them. Political scientists call this face-saving behavior. Moses remains resolute but not triumphant, each time warning before judgment comes. The pattern conveys a lesson about accountability. Power without compassion leads to isolation, and isolation leads to irrational decisions that harm one's own people. The narrative slows before plague 10, the death of the firstborn. Hebrews are instructed to sacrifice a lamb, smear blood on doorposts, roast the meat whole, and eat in haste with sandals on. This night is Passover. Anthropologists note that communal meals marking deliverance bind people more than any charter document. Blood on the lintel becomes a boundary marker between oppression and freedom. Epidemiologists sometimes point out that isolation of families that night could also have limited exposure to an airborne pathogen. Whether coincidence or providence, the symbolic weight is unmistakable. Midnight strikes. A cry rises from every Egyptian household. Pharaoh finally summons Moses and orders the Hebrews out. They leave so quickly that dough does not rise, which is why unleavened bread still anchors Passover tables from Brooklyn to Bakersfield. Exodus records 600,000 men besides women and children. Demographers debate the exact count, suggesting that the Hebrew phrase Eleph can mean clan rather than thousand, placing the migration in the low tens of thousands. Still a staggering convoy by ancient standards. They march southeast toward the Sea of Reeds, likely the marshy lakes north of the modern Suez Canal. The Egyptian chariots pursue, wheels slicing through firm ground. Then a night wind pushes water aside enough to expose a corridor of mud. Oceanographers have modeled how sustained winds of 40 miles per hour can create a wind-setdown effect, temporarily lowering water on one side of a lake. At dawn, when the wind shifts, the water returns, engulfing the chariots. The Israelites watch debris washing ashore, the empire's military hardware reduced to flotsam. Miriam grabs a tambourine and leads a spontaneous anthem. Scholars of collective trauma say music often initiates healing by turning chaos into narrative. By the time the sun rises fully, the people stand on the far bank in silence. They have no home yet, only a horizon. Some carry relics of Egypt like copper mirrors or ankhs, reminders of a culture that shaped them even as it enslaved them. They must now craft a new identity in the wilderness. Chapter 1 ends not with a victory parade, but with a vast question. What do you do with freedom once you have it? The desert ahead holds the answer and the risk. Chapter 2, Desert Codes and a Mountain of Fire. They called it freedom. Yet for the first nights on the far shore, the people of Israel felt more exposed than liberated. There were no slave masters, but neither were there brick quotas, familiar cook fires, or the steady rush of the Nile. In daylight, the desert looked endless, a quilt of rock and gravel shimmering beneath white heat. At dusk it turned violet, and the wind howled like a hungry beast. Children asked whether the sand itself might swallow them. Parents had no answer. They had crossed the sea, but they had not yet crossed the threshold into nationhood. Modern satellite images show the coastal route from the northern tip of the Gulf of Suez curving east and then south. In antiquity, that road was guarded by Egyptian garrisons. Moses chose instead the interior wilderness known as the Shur, a region of limestone mesas and salt flats, where even Bedouin thought twice before traveling. His decision was strategic. Freedom needed distance, and distance required trust that water and food would somehow appear. 3 days in, canteens were empty. The next oasis shimmered on the horizon, a classic mirage caused when warm air near the ground bends light upward, projecting a false pool. By evening, the people reached a spring only to discover that its water tasted like copper coins. Geologists now know that wells in the Sinai often carry high levels of magnesium and calcium sulfate, creating a bitter profile. The crowd erupted in panic. Moses cried out to heaven. The narrative says the Lord showed him a tree. He threw a branch into the pool, and the water became sweet. Botanists suggest that wood rich in tannins can precipitate minerals, clarifying water. Chemistry or miracle? The spring became drinkable, and the mob settled for the night. The next crisis was hunger. Livestock supplies had dwindled, and grain bags were nearly empty. At dawn, a thin white layer blanketed the ground, sparkling like frost. Moses urged them to taste it. The Hebrew word was manna. Literally, what is it? Scientists proposed 2 candidates. One is a scale insect that feeds on tamarisk trees and secretes droplets rich in glucose that crystallize overnight. Another is lichen that forms brittle flakes after rare desert rains. Both substances melt under direct sun, matching the instruction to gather quickly before heat dissolves the gift. Nutritionists confirm the sugars could sustain nomads when supplemented with the occasional goat or sheep. The people collected an omer per person, about 2 quarts, and discovered a principle that felt like the first law of their new society. Take only what you need. Hoarders found their surplus crawling with worms by morning. Every 6th day, the quantity miraculously doubled, allowing a day of rest. In a world without paid vacations, the notion of Sabbath was revolutionary. Modern labor studies show that productivity rises when workers enjoy regular downtime. The desert lesson anticipated economic research by 30 centuries. As weeks passed, the convoy moved toward a jagged massif locals called Jabal Musa. Geological surveys describe its granite peaks as remnants of an ancient volcanic core. The Hebrew text names it Sinai, the mountain of God. At its base, a wide valley provided natural amphitheater acoustics. Moses ordered tents pitched in concentric rings, livestock kept at the perimeter, and a cordon drawn around the foothills. No one was to ascend without permission. On the morning of the 3rd day, thunder cracked across a cloudless sky. Electromagnetic storms, known as dry lightning, can erupt when hot air rises along steep slopes. Flash photographs capture a similar phenomenon today called volcanic lightning, though there is no active cone here. Whatever the cause, the combination of booming sound, rolling smoke, and tremors convinced even the skeptics that they were standing in a meeting zone between Earth and a power beyond calculation. Moses climbed alone, disappearing into charcoal mist. Seismographs installed centuries later record minor quakes in the region, severe enough to rattle stones, perhaps the echo of tectonic shifts that once rattled the prophet's knees. After several hours, he returned with 2 stone tablets, each face incised with proto-alphabetic letters. Archaeologists debate the script's form, but its content is unmistakable. 10 words, later called commandments, carve principles into rock that psychologists say humans already sense in conscience, yet often ignore. Honor life, honor fidelity, honor truth, honor rest, honor the unseen source of being. The people promised immediate obedience, a declaration as fragile as desert glass. Moses climbed again for a longer summit meeting, leaving Aaron in charge. Days lengthened into weeks. Down below, unease festered. Some said Moses had perished in the smoke. Others whispered that the invisible God was too remote, that Egypt's tangible icons offered better comfort. They pooled gold jewelry brought from the Nile and melted it in a makeshift furnace. The resulting calf resembled Apis, a bovine deity of fertility. Ritual dancers circled the idol as drums pounded. Social historians call this phenomenon reversion to familiar structures in the face of uncertainty. The cost would be severe. When Moses finally descended carrying fresh tablets, he saw the revelry and hurled the stones to the ground. The shattering echoed off canyon walls. Anthropologists note that breaking a treaty document signaled the covenant itself was broken. Moses ground the calf to powder, mixed it with water, and made the crowd drink. The message tasted metallic on every tongue. Idolatry poisons from within. Punishment followed. A clan loyal to Moses swept through camp, quelling the riot. Some scholars recoil at the violence. Others point out that emerging nations often experience convulsions during identity formation. In the aftermath, Moses carved new tablets, placing them inside a gilded chest called the Arkansas. Its lid bore two winged figures facing each other, a seat of mercy overshadowing law. The chest traveled beneath a canopy of woven linen dyed blue and crimson. Every journey included tangible memory, both of human failure and offered forgiveness. With order restored, the convoy resumed its trek. They skirted sandstone wadis and basalt ridges, following what modern GPS mapping suggests is the most direct line toward the southern border of Canaan. A column of cloud visible by day and glowing by night marked the route. Atmospheric physicists theorize that desert dust illuminated by starlight can create a faint luminescence, but eyewitness language is plain. They felt led. A year after leaving Egypt, they approached Kadesh Barnea, a natural spring that still bubbles clear water today. Moses selected 12 scouts, one from each tribe, to reconnoiter the highlands ahead. For 40 days, the scouts hiked terraced hills, gathered pomegranates, figs, grape clusters so large they required a shoulder pole. They also saw fortified cities perched on ridges and inhabitants whose stature seemed daunting. Anthropometry studies suggest Canaanite elites averaged 5'6", hardly giants. Yet to former slaves, any armored warrior loomed enormous. When the scouts returned, opinion split. 10 argued that the land devoured its residents, that sons of Anak great warriors would crush the immigrants. 2 Caleb and Joshua countered that the land was exceedingly good, flowing with milk and honey. Crowd psychology turned ugly. Shouts rose to stone the optimists and elect a leader to return to Egypt. In modern terms, the people flirted with reverse migration, choosing the predictability of oppression over the risk of destiny. A sudden blaze lit the sanctuary tent. The divine voice pronounced sentence. The generation that refused to enter would wander until every adult over 20 except Caleb and Joshua lay buried beneath the dunes. Statisticians calculate that meant roughly 40 years, sufficient for a new cohort raised on manna rather than Egyptian leeks to take the lead. Some men attempted a rogue invasion the next morning, but were driven back by Amalekite raiders familiar with ill combat. Trauma teaches slowly, but it teaches. Decades slid past unrecorded except for brief vignettes. At Tabra, fire scorched camp edges after another flare of complaint. At Kibroth Hatavava, the craving for meat led to a migration of quail driven low by seasonal winds. Ornithologists confirm that millions of Copernicus quail still traverse Sinai en route to Eurasian breeding grounds, occasionally dropping from exhaustion near Red Sea shores. The people gorged until an outbreak of foodborne illness ended the feast. One by one, the elders who remembered Pharaoh died. Even Miriam and Aaron fell, their graves marked by cairns that tourists still seek, though no reliable coordinates exist. Moses remained, his hair silver, his eyes surprisingly clear. He too would not cross the Jordan. He knew that leadership sometimes means preparing others to finish what you began. Near the end of the trek, they circled Edom and camped on the plains of Moab. From a ridge, they could see the Jordan Valley green with date palms. Irrigation canals glinted like threads of glass. The end was tangible at last. Moses began reciting the journey, embedding laws into stories, because memory untold evaporates. Linguists observe that oral repetition with slight variation brands neural pathways deeper than rote decree. The people listened, young faces absorbing legacy they never witnessed. He closed with a song that compared God to an eagle hovering over a nest, stirring fledglings to flight, catching them on broad wings when they faltered. The metaphor pushed them forward. The desert had been a cradle and a crucible, now a river-bordered promise, and crossing would require courage learned only by walking the harsh spaces between. As Moses climbed Mount Nebo for his final view, no one followed. He looked west across a landscape that scholars say was unusually lush during a climatic window of the late Bronze Age. He saw vineyards awaiting cultivation and highways linking Egypt to Mesopotamia, trade routes his people would someday patrol. He breathed in summit air, exhaled a blessing, and was gone. Tradition claims God buried him where no pilgrim could build a shrine, ensuring that the focus would remain on the journey, not the hero. Back in camp, the ark waited beneath its linen canopy. Joshua stood beside it, steady hands poised to lift the journey's literal heartbeat. The cloud had moved east, hovering above the Jordan waters. At the bank, reeds rustled. Frogs chirped. Somewhere behind them, desert sand began to cool, covering countless footprints. Ahead, the river flowed, and beyond it, a country destined to strain every lesson of the wilderness. The story would go on, but that belongs to another chapter. Chapter 3: Algorithms of the Plagues and the Night the Sea Split. Imagine a lecture hall at UC San Diego. Rows of tiered seats glow with laptop light. The air carries espresso and coastal salt. At the podium stands Dr. Maya Evans, a senior researcher in paleoclimatology. Behind her, the first slide reads in tall blue letters, Exodus Code, when theology meets geophysics. The audience looks like a cross-section of contemporary America. Generation Z undergrads in hoodies, returning veterans using the GI Bill, 2 retired rabbis taking notes in longhand, a Twitch streamer in the back row live captioning for his followers. Maya smiles and begins. Tonight, she says, we will reopen the most famous disaster sequence in world literature, the 10 Plagues, and test whether the forces of nature might have provided the raw material for a story that billions consider sacred. She clicks, and a satellite image of Lake Tana in Ethiopia fills the screen. This lake feeds the blue Nile, which in turn feeds Egypt. During strong El Nino years, torrential rain strips iron-rich soil from the Ethiopian highlands. The overloaded river runs brick red. Add late summer heat, she says, and cyanobacteria bloom like scarlet paint. Oxygen crashes and fish die en masse. The Apura papyrus from Egypt's first intermediate period records the river as blood and men shrink from tasting it. The students lean forward. The first plague has a data set. Once frog populations lose their aquatic home, they surge onto shore to escape suffocation. Maya shows a time lapse of modern frogs swarming Louisiana levees after a toxic bloom. A camera view tilts to an empty riverbank covered in quivering green bodies. 2 days later, the same spot is motionless except for clouds of flies. Without amphibians to devour larvae, insect populations explode. This cascade gives us plagues 2, 3, and 4 frogs, that's biting flies. An entomologist named Dr. Aaron Feldman joins by video link. Frogs function like biological levees, he says. Remove them, and mosquitoes, such as the Culex genus, lay eggs unchecked. Those mosquitoes can carry viruses similar to modern West Nile that sicken cattle and humans. Ancient text records that livestock fell in great numbers, which matches Plague 5. What about the mysterious boils that afflicted both man and beast? Maya switches to photographs from Central Asia during a livestock anthrax outbreak. Purple lesions appear on skin exposed to contaminated animal hides. Anthrax spores thrive when carcasses rot in shallow, flooded ground. It is a grim picture, yet the logic is relentless. One domino tips another. The seventh plague hail may sound unlikely in North Africa until you consider supercell dynamics. When blistering desert air meets a cool, moist front from the Mediterranean, violent updrafts form ice the size of walnuts. Maya plays a short clip from Egyptian television in March 2020 where hail peppers Cairo traffic. The class murmurs. When hail mashes barley and flax down to stubble, locusts follow. They ride the same wind corridor, devouring what little remains. Swarms still blanket East Africa, some years darkening the sky for hours. Plague 8 follows Plague 7 the same way night follows dusk. Now Maya dims the lights and shows a simulation of a volcanic eruption in the Aegean around 1620, before the Common Era. Sulfate spikes in Greenland ice cores corroborate the event. A dense ash cloud could mute daylight for days. For Egyptians who worship the sun god Ra, such a darkness would feel like the cosmos turning inside out. The room is silent. The 10th plague, death of the firstborn, resists simple modeling, yet toxicologists propose an ergot fungus scenario. Grain dampened by hail then stored in clay silos can grow claviceps purpurea, which produces alkaloids strong enough to kill. Firstborns in elite households often ate the first and largest portions. Hebrews, according to the narrative, roasted lamb and baked bread in haste, thus bypassing the poisoned granaries. The story merges epidemiology with ritual. Maya steps away from the podium. Does this sequence prove Exodus? Absolutely not, she says. But it shows how a single agricultural year laced with extreme anomalies could feel indistinguishable from direct divine intervention. Wonder, she reminds them, grows in the narrow gap between certainty and possibility. The scene now moves to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Computer scientist Ricardo Jimenez calibrates a computational fluid dynamics model labeled YAMSUF 4.0. He feeds in bathymetric scans of Lake Bala, one of the northern reed basins along the Isthmus of Suez. Then he forces a constant easterly gale at roughly 100 kilometers per hour for 12 hours. On the monitor, water piles toward the western shore, exposing a land bridge 2 meters high and several kilometers long. When the wind stops, the water rushes back in a single hydraulic bore. The Hebrew text describes a wall of water on the right and on the left. Ricardo watches red chariot icons drown in blue pixels and whispers dynamic set-down verified. The wind-setdown theory is not fringe. Oceanographer Doran Knopf published a peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Physical Oceanography detailing the mechanics. Internet skeptics accuse him of deflating miracles, but Knopf counters that mathematics is itself miraculous predictive order hidden inside chaos. South of the Isthmus, the Red Sea overlays a living tectonic boundary. Geologist Dr. Lena Tsai takes the class on a virtual field trip to the Danakil Depression in Eritrea, where divergent plates rip the crust open like taffy. A moderate quake could have preceded the windstorm, she explains, cracking salt flats and releasing methane bubbles that lighten water density. The combined effect might sharpen the water withdrawal and intensify the rebound surge. She cues drone footage of milky turquoise pools trembling under micro-tremors. Now imagine this at night, she says. The wind howls. The ground quivers. Water split. Any shepherd would read that as an open gate to freedom. Evening settles over Brooklyn, where a modern family begins the Passover Seder. They pour 10 drops of wine, one for each plague, reducing the joy of the cup to remember the suffering of others. Whether the plagues were cyanobacteria or an angel of judgment is less critical than the ethical program encoded in the ritual. Neuroscience confirms that repeated storytelling wires collective memory and also offers catharsis. The Exodus becomes portable cultural software that every generation can run when it feels trapped between tyrant and sea. Back in San Diego, Maya cues her final slide. When sacred law declares remember, you were slaves, it installs empathy into policy, she says. When geology shows that seas can in fact open under specific wind and plate conditions, it installs humility about what we label impossible. When both truths meet, they remind us that liberation is rarely instantaneous. It moves through plagues of doubt, nights of impossible wind, decades of wilderness coding, and finally into territories we must cultivate ourselves. Phones remain silent. The students ponder the thinness of the line between faith and physics. The professor shuts down the projector. Next week, she tells them we tackle Jericho. Was it seismology or chauffeur? Bring your laptops and your questions. They file into the coastal night. Some query academic databases for cyanobacteria bloom cycles. Others text parents to ask about this year's Passover details. A few simply gaze at the low fog drifting across Interstate 5. It hangs like an inverted pillar, reminding them that ancient stories still ride modern weather, and that sometimes the most powerful miracles are the ones hidden inside algorithms, waiting for the right conditions to unfold.